Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Bree Hogue, and I am the sales manager of Powell's Books here in Portland, Oregon. Tonight, we're joined by Lee Vandervoo in conversation with Isaac Vergun. Lee's new book is As the World Burns, the New Generation of Activists and the Landmark Legal Fight Against Climate Change. When 21 youth activists filed Juliana v. the United States, they asserted that the government's continued negligence of the environment constituted a violation of their rights to life, liberty, and property. In As the World Burns, Lee follows the still evolving legal case as she tells the plaintiff's stories, all against the backdrop of the current climate-related crisis and the mass protests happening around the world. Lee Vandervoo is an award-winning investigative and environmental journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, among other publications. Lee won an Oregon Book Award for general nonfiction for her 2016 book, The Fish Market, which chronicles the gentrification of the sea in the name of sustainable seafood. Joining Lee tonight is Isaac Vergun. Isaac is a climate activist and one of the plaintiffs in Juliana v. United States. Isaac has participated in many youth summits and environmental conferences. He is a co-founder of Youth Acting for Our Earth. He was the leader of his high school's Black Student Union and participated in the Oregon Youth Legislative Initiative and served as a teen board member of the Oregon Jewish Community Youth Foundation. He's currently in college studying communications and environmental studies. We'll start this event with a conversation between Lee and Isaac, followed by a Q&A. So if you have a question for either Lee or Isaac tonight, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit your question there. You can support Lee by purchasing a copy of her book at powells.com. I've posted a link to the book in our chat module, so you can click on the chat button to see that link. Lee, Isaac, thank you so much for joining us here at Powell's Books. It's a pleasure to have you this evening.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here, virtually here. And my book about Isaac's case starts with the canceled trial in October of 2018, and it follows the plaintiffs through a year of climate mayhem, basically, and political upheaval, and kind of culminates in the early this year, actually. So a lot has happened since early this year, Isaac. Pandemic, uprisings over racial justice and equity, and catastrophic hurricanes, floods, fires. How's this for you in your first semester of college?
Yeah, it's really weird. It's a little bit overwhelming at the same time, a little bit. So in the Tualatin Valley where I live, out in Beaverton, Oregon, we had some pretty bad wildfire smoke for about 10 days. And so I kind of was like, I wasn't really with the smoke, and it was affecting my asthma, which is one of the reasons why I joined the lawsuit. And so I kind of shipped myself out to DC, where I'm going to be finishing up the rest of the semester. But 2020 has really definitely been a big catastrophic mess and chaotic mess, but we do what we can, you know?
Yeah, so you're at Howard, right? I
Yeah.
love the shirt. It's Howard, the Go Bisons. How were you expecting to start college, and how are you starting college? How's it different?
No, yeah, like basically everyone, like in the January and early February, we were thinking that, you know, college is going to start on time, senior year is going to go smoothly, just like how it was for everyone else for years, many years before us. But then COVID hit, and my school district, like everyone else's school district, was definitely under-equipped and didn't really know what to do. But instead of kind of continuing online school, they dropped seniors on their head after what was supposed to be our spring break, saying, you guys don't have school anymore. If you all had D's or above, you graduated. Good job. And so I didn't do any school. I've been out of school for 6 months until I started school mid-August for Howard. So that was really interesting, getting back into the swing of things for school after going cold turkey, basically. But I'm doing what I can, online school at home has its perks, just log on as soon as you wake up, and you just sit in class and then go back to sleep, then wake up again for your next class and whatnot. But I am at Howard and I was on the West Coast, so an 8 a.m. class would actually be a 5 a.m. class. And so I'd be waking up at like 4:45 every morning, 5 days a week, to do school all morning and then homework all afternoon, and then some mild restful sleep in the evening. But yeah, I did what I can, got to make the best of this kind of bad situation.
And now you're at least in your correct time zone, right?
Yes, thankfully. Yeah, that alone saved so much time.
Yeah, you probably feel a lot better too, I would guess.
Yeah.
So like a lot of folks talk about, when we go back to normal, right? When we go back to normal, and knowing what you know about climate change and having been a climate activist for so many years, what do you think about that idea that we'll just go back to normal when this is over?
Oh yeah. A lot of people have been saying, what are we gonna do when we go back to normal? Even in the presidential debate, they were discussing, how are we gonna get back to normal? What is this country gonna look like? And I don't think that it's going to revert to how things were pre-COVID, especially with the revival of the BLM movement over quarantine in the summer, and with being more aware of climate crisis, and with also just COVID-19 completely taking us by surprise. A lot of families and communities have been scarred by this whole chaotic 2020 year, and getting back to normal is going to be different. It's not going to be necessarily going back into our comfort zones as we were before, but it's going to be more of like adjusting. Normal is going to be us constantly being aware and needing to adjust for contingencies that we didn't think were going to happen, and just disaster preparedness and readiness, and also social awareness at the same time. Because just because COVID-19 happens doesn't mean that environmental disasters won't happen, or racism is over, or whatnot. It's just, things are just going to be coming more in front of our faces rather than us not paying attention to them as much before. So it's going to be us trying to figure out as Americans and as a world, how are we going to solve all of these at once? Like, like instead of putting things on the back burner, all of these things are on fire, literally. So how are we going to put out these fires at the same time?
Yeah, and I often think of COVID too as like, it's not, I mean, this isn't a natural occurrence. Of course, we know that COVID-19 started in a wet market, right? We know patient 0 was a bat and maybe patient number 1 was a pangolin, and that they came into contact like because of the way that folks shop in these wet markets in Asia. But that doesn't mean that isn't happening in the natural environment, right? Like as we have like biodiversity loss, we're like pushing animals into contact with one another in these weird ways that promote disease, right? So, we've been warned about the increased potentially of pandemics, or also just the way disease travels, like Zika traveling in the US, or even like Lyme disease moving west because of conditions changing. So like the idea to me that this is, the one and only pandemic, the one and only big disease that we're going to be battling in a world that's breaking down from a climate perspective seems unlikely.
No, yeah, I completely agree.
So what were your plans? I mean, I know you've been super active in climate work for a long time. What were your plans for climate activism this fall before COVID hit, and what's different now?
No, yeah. So before COVID hit, I was kind of trying to figure out some networking, trying to connect with some environmental majors at Howard, and environmental students at other universities in the area, like Georgetown, George Washington, and American, and trying to start a Sunrise Movement chapter at Howard, because we definitely had the numbers. All we need is 10 people to sign on for to start a club at Howard, and then a couple officer ranks on top of that, which we could fill those positions easily. But then that basically got completely derailed once COVID hit. And people kind of were in their own zones, trying to figure out, everyone was scrambling, I'd say, for at least the first 2 months as to, transitioning everything online, on Zoom. People were getting hard to be in contact with because of just circumstances. And so that kind of fell apart, but I'm definitely going to try to revive that if we're going to be like a hybrid campus this spring, the spring term. But a lot of my climate events and rallies and protests and anything that I was thinking of being planned kind of just got shut down because it involves people being together in a crowded space. That's how we start. That's a movement. That's what a movement is. And so with COVID, that kind of just halted all of that. And so that removed the big group element, and having the people around working on like one goal together in like a crowded space, like making signs, protesting, rallying, whatever, all that stuff just kind of was out the window and out of the picture. And so that I kind of had a little lull of my climate activity through COVID, which wasn't the greatest, but I mean, we're trying to transition to Zoom.
It makes sense, though. I mean, there's a lot of transition happening. And also, like, didn't your climate work kind of dovetail with some election plans this year? Were you planning some, like, canvassing or election work?
Yeah. If I was going to be at Howard and on campus and everything, I was going to be joining the Biden-Harris campaign and canvassing in the DC area where Howard is, and working with other students and just promoting just discourse on campus, and setting up a polling booth, or voting booth on campus too. That was good. That was the plan. But I mean, we're here now.
Yeah. So how do you translate it? I mean, do you translate that to the web, or you just find yourself, I mean, you're in your first semester in college, you're like under the gun no matter what. I mean, this is a very busy time for you, a very important time. So, I mean, I completely appreciate why that might be all you have room for, but do you find ways to translate that activity online, or is it just on hold right now?
Oh yeah, definitely kind of spamming my social media accounts with just voting, putting up hashtags, commenting on people's posts, just hashtag voting, hashtag Biden-Harris, hashtag everything, kind of just blowing up the pages. So that's all people see. And so even though they might get sick of it, maybe they'll motivate, maybe they'll be like, okay, I'm so sick of seeing this. Maybe if I vote, this stuff will disappear. Maybe if I just register to vote or whatever, something will happen. And so kind of just making sure that everyone, especially in my generation, votes, and everyone like around my age and freshmen in college vote, because our voice matters and is very important, and probably will be the greatest difference in this upcoming election, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, the youth vote is super important for sure. That's, yeah, no question. What's your major?
I'm doing a combined major at Howard. It's called MJFC, which is Media, Journalism, Film, and Communications. And then I'm going to be minoring in environmental studies my junior year.
Okay, so gearing toward the things that I do somewhat, right?
Yes.
What do you think about media coverage of your case in climate change?
No, yeah. So media coverage with the climate crisis is very interesting because there's so much new climate science that's being put out, like what seems like every day. Like, oh, we have until 2030 to reduce our emissions to zero, otherwise irreversible climate change will occur. 2020 is the last year. No, 2025, we gotta go carbon neutral, but we could still have other things. And so it seems like the media is kind of putting out different information, which is all true, but then it gets diluted at the same time. Like the main messages are also getting diluted. Like for the longest time, 2020 was the goal. 2020 was the time when we were supposed to go carbon neutral. 2020 was the time we were supposed to reduce our emissions by 25%, 35%, or whatever. And we're here now, and it seems like we haven't, or companies and as a country and as a world, we haven't made much progress as we would have liked. And resulting in that is catastrophic climate change that we're already experiencing. Exacerbated wildfire seasons, uncontrollable wildfires, floods, landslides, droughts, and that's just in the United States in just the month of September. So it's a very pressing issue that the media really is trying to grasp, but it's also really hard to pin down because it just gets muddled in the water.
Yeah, it's super hard to pin down. Media coverage, I had a lot of questions about it, writing about your case, like especially being a member of the media and learning about the work that you were doing and your co-plaintiffs and attorneys, and trying to get a grasp of the climate picture relative to the evidence that you guys presented in court versus how I understood it, as not even just like a general news consumer, but as a member of the press. There was a significant gap there for me, and it was a little bit horrifying. Honestly, horrifying.
No, yeah.
But to your point about, how the press has kind of portrayed climate change, I got some, so I did some reporting around that when I was working on this book, and I got some just really interesting tales and answers from people who are kind of like, maybe the guard that came before me as to how they got to this place where climate facts weren't uniform, and often reporters were maybe over engaging in the debate aspect of it. And one of the ways that it was explained was that, when you're a journalist, you're kind of a slave to your editor, right? And that a lot of editors get that way by being, involved in political arenas. Like, you don't climb to the top of your organization by being the science reporter. Like, it's very unusual. And those folks more understand a world of balanced facts, right? Because they're dealing with things like taxes, and there's a case for and a case against. And so that balancing test was kind of full tilt exploited. And just beginning in like the Bush days, George W. days, where disinformation took off. I think one guy that I interviewed put it this way, that there was a crazy quilt of right-wing mouthpieces that all come really out of the oil industry, and they're saying crazy things like the moral case for fossil fuels, and it started to kind of really put a lot of disinformation out there, and exploited journalists' training really, and newsroom structures to like full tilt put pressures on this balancing act. Like, as long as there's an alternate set of facts, you have to pay attention to that. And editors were really sensitive to it, and they pushed journalists toward this debate place where we stayed until media started to fracture for this and other reasons. And now it's like everybody's at their own water cooler with this idea.
No, yeah.
Yeah. So if it's okay, I want to take a short break and just like read a little bit from the book where I talked to your co-plaintiff about this, Shuteska. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I talked to Shuteska Martinez about this. He's a co-plaintiff of Isaac's because Shuteska is basically like a media savant. I mean, the guy's been in front of media his entire life. His first public speeches, he was like 6 years old. When he was 15, he was the one of the only people to ever have spoken to the United Nations who was not in government, and impressively did it in like 3 languages. But he grew up in this exact era of disinformation as somebody who was on the other side of the notebook and very, very aware of like the disinformation. So I asked him to talk to me about it, and this is kind of what he said. I'll let Chutezcott describe how all this looks to someone born in the middle of it, and how it appeared to him throughout his activist life. I didn't feel like we were taken super seriously. There was excitement around young people being involved, but again, it was much less than there is now, he says. Journalists didn't dig deep on the urgency of climate action for youth, didn't ask why the youth voice was rising, and didn't report on what those rising voices were saying about intergenerational equity in a world on a relentless consumptive bent, pushing ecology to an extreme. Since then, there's been a massive shift. Social media raised the voice of the affected generation finally, Chutezcott says, and it became the chief organizing tool of young leaders across a spectrum of social issues: climate justice, gun violence, Black Lives Matter. All used social media to transform the way their stories were being told. This changed the way people perceive youth leadership in America, in the world, and suddenly reporters tuned in. Media organizations began taking note as the youth calls to address the climate crisis rang out with increasing urgency. Because of social, young people have been able to crash the narrative more on our own without depending on mainstream media, Chutezcott says. Editors would agree. The Columbia Journalism Review writing that social media allowed youth activists to begin driving the news, initiating actions and protests that called media to the cause. They wrote op-eds, produced videos for YouTube, Vice, and Vox, and posted and responded to climate news with enough fervor to keep the conversation spinning around the clock. Teen Vogue editor Lucy Diavolo would summarize, telling CJR, social media has altered the landscape of authority. Even still, press coverage remains fuzzy on why youth can claim this authority, if not disbelieving, then at times failing to acknowledge the degree to which the next generation's inheritance is spoiled. To speak these truths any way he can is more in line with the way Chutezcott grew up, with empowered siblings and fellow activists who also fought for the earth, other children who ran fire across desert, who climbed to mesas, kids who danced prayers until they could not. For them, their identities were invisible in all kinds of ways, and their media identity remains somewhat indistinct. Google Chutezcott and you'll find featured snippets of his Wikipedia entry, channel recommendations for YouTube, Spotify, Pandora, links to his Twitter, Instagram, his Facebook, and it's the digital life of a person who lives loudly online, but whose presence in the mainstream press still struggles to understand. They have just failed so much in the last 10 years at really capturing the energy and the essence of what stories need to be shared about the youth movement, Chutezcott says. Now, he says, it's like there's a media woke quota. Every progressive channel is loading youth perspective and voice, angling for relevance with that growing demographic of people who are following and clicking and sharing, but it's still somehow striking the wrong note for him, whether it's 1-minute videos where people talk about social change in a simplistic, idealistic way, or the Greta note that will soon emerge. We all know this note by now. It's the one in which the history of the youth climate movement has been scrubbed clean, where all active youth were inspired by Greta, replaced by Greta. There's been a whole very revealing truth of how the media really selects their figures that they elevate and they put on platforms. And much respect and love for everything that Greta has done, Chutezcott says. But it's much easier for the media to highlight a young, privileged, white Swedish girl than it is to talk about the young water protectors that are fighting pipelines in South Dakota, or the many, many young leaders of color that have been on the front lines of this work for generations who have inherited these struggles. We're still trying really hard to kind of push through the barriers that we have at every level of the work that we do, from the political climate to the lack of representation in the media. He's in Southern California recording his next album, so he's outside when we have this conversation on the phone. There's a backdrop of singing birds on his end of the call, and I can tell that he's walking, or at least pacing, because the reception has a kind of rhythmic dip. Chutezcott has just held 2 events with Greta, but what he's saying is that for all the humility Greta has in the face of her newfound fame, and for all the respect that he has for her The iconography of Greta has taught him that he is never going to be as sympathetic as a white girl. For as far as the press could come in its coverage of the climate crisis and of this movement, it has not come farther than lionizing a person who has the right looks to take the youth climate conversation mainstream. It erases him and a lot of other people like him, whose American story perhaps has something more critical to say. And this possibility of erasure is an ominous prospect for Juliana too, a profoundly important court case that has yet to see trial. There you have it. She does God's 2 cents. Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, very much agree. Yeah, he covered 2 pretty key points that I've been thinking about for a little while now too. That being that media has kind of refocused and kind of strayed away from its path as it used to, as it being the first defense to our country's democracy and fact checking, as to more of an politicized, gotta see all points of view, even if they are baseless. And also, he highlighted the point of that there's a ton of youth voices that not necessarily haven't been heard, just haven't been given the attention that they should, and that we all do respect Greta. Like, we respect Greta. There's no hate or anything to her, and more power to her. But there's also those same media outlets that should be highlighting and raising up the voices of youth of color, youth of LGBTQ plus community, minority youth, who are doing the same climate work for just as long, maybe even longer, that pertains to our own more American soil. And so that's something that kind of hasn't really been put to the attention of mainstream media, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you make a really good point about, like, media was created as a check on government, and we are supposed to be here to fact check and make sure we cut through all this partisan baloney. And it's actually, I think, in the case of the climate conversation, almost amplified the confusion around it, which is really, really unfortunate. I know you have ideas about how you'd like to see all this resolved, like on the solutions front. Can you talk about that a little?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a whole bunch of, oh my, there's a lot. So I guess from a policy standpoint, even though I'm not a very political person and I don't necessarily really want to get into politics, trying to compromise solutions and combine 2 ideas into 1 solution. A very big platform that I feel like a big part of the Republican Party has been trying to push for a while is the creation of jobs in communities that are rural, and because they don't have as many economic opportunities. While another platform that Democrats are trying to push forward is just green building. And so why can't we do both of those things at once? We provide people who live in those rural communities in rural Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Arkansas, the resources and the training to build solar panel grids in their closest major cities. Why don't we train them to become technicians to geothermal plants? Why don't we train these people in sustainable energy and transition away from fossil fuel energy? Because it's killing 2 birds with 1 stone, in my opinion. And the only thing that's holding them back is the deep pockets of the Koch brothers and other fossil fuel interests on the Hill. And so once we get rid of those entities and their influence, I feel like that's something that's definitely in the picture.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the transition, the energy transition and jobs, I think, I mean, we've heard a lot of talk about that. They can totally go hand in hand. I also heard a stat like the other day that I think is really interesting, that for every dollar that you spend on front end prevention, you save 6 in disaster relief funds, and that the US is kind of getting in the hole on disasters, on rebuilding, on funding our way out of things like hurricanes. Maybe if we had fewer of those, that might be a smart investment too.
Yeah.
I know we have a few questions in the Q&A. I can see them kind of chiming in. Bree, do you want to jump in and throw some questions at us?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a good time for those of you listening to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add some more questions for Isaac or Lee. But we'll go ahead and get started with what we have. First question is, what or who sparked your interest in climate change and environmental studies or journalism? I think that's for both of you. Do you want to go first, Lee?
Oh gosh, okay. What or who sparked my interest in environment? I mean, I think I've always been kind of a natural writer, and I have a long history of documenting. I mean, I have notebooks in my closet in my office here that are like from when I was in middle school, and I would just document everything all around. So it was a habit. I was really interested in the science. I don't know if it was a factor or not in my interest. I've thought about this, but I grew up in a community that was studied for cluster illness in the 80s and had a lot of environmental pollution and a lot of illness and disease because of air pollution. It was kind of undetermined when I was growing up there, so I don't know if it was a huge influence, but we did learn later that the culprit was benzene and TCE contaminated water, but that wasn't until I was an adult. Still, I mean, seeing people get sick, I think, from the environment was certainly a factor. And I think maybe gave me a sense all along that sometimes things we think are safe are not so safe. We thought that about benzene once. Not to say that I distrust science, but that caution is always a good thing. And so I don't know, I mean, some of that inspired me. I think environmental stories also just happen to have a lot of the elements of journalism that I really like. I like to work outside. I like to work with people who are really interesting characters. And the stories that I love most are the stories that ask the very important question in society of who benefits and who pays. Very often, if you're writing an environmental story, you're writing that story, and it kind of often takes you to this, like these really important American truths that I really like writing about. How about you, Isaac?
So how I got into environmental kind of studies and communications and all that and journalism kind of started with when I first heard about climate change in the first place was I was in, I think I was in first or second grade, and my sister went to the Oregon Zoo for her field trip, and my mom was chaperoning, and so she was with her group, and there was this little plaque that talked about climate change, like really little plaque at the polar bear section. So this was definitely like 2008 or 9 at the time. And it was saying, oh, climate change is warming the sea levels. It was actually global warming that said on there. And it's melting the ice and polar bears are drowning because of it. But it might not be a real thing. It might not, it questioned climate change. And so my sister kind of relayed that information back to me when I was asking her about her day. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm 6 years old. What am I to know about it or anything? But it wasn't really until middle school, 5th grade, when I realized the environmental implications that the climate crisis has for my sister's homeland. My sister was adopted from the Marshall Islands, which is a low-lying island nation in the Pacific Ocean. And they have very frequent king tides that literally flood the whole entire island. And literally 1 meter of sea level rise could put many atolls underwater, and then a couple more, and then the main island, Maduro, would go underwater. And so just safeguarding my sister's homeland was of the utmost priority to my sister and I. And this was before I realized the environmental implications to myself that climate change would happen. My family really fostered the idea that we got to take care of everyone. We got to be global citizens and take care of people, even if it comes at a little bit of an expense to us. If we're all like healthy, then that's gonna be all good, and we're gonna be all good, and we're gonna make it through in the end. So that's kind of why I got involved in the first place. And then journalism and communications, I've been a pretty good writer for a while. I think that's how like most communication majors are and journalists are. It's like you kind of know for a little while that you're a quick writer and good writer. And so I just like might as well do both things and do a combined major, environmental studies and communications. So yeah.
I think I didn't answer the climate part of that question. And honestly, the thing that got me interested in climate change was your case. I had never reported on it before. I had always reported on toxins and other environmental stories. I saw your case and it kept coming by the transom, and I kept thinking, who are these young people? What are they all about? I was very curious about you guys.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's a good transition. There are two questions in the Q&A, one from April and one from Sandy. And they both want to know, what is the latest news on the case and where does the case go from here?
Yeah, so right now the case is under review from the Ninth Circuit. Unfortunately, we heard in early of this year, I think it was January, that they had dismissed our case in a 2-1 decision, but we appealed. And then COVID happened. And so we are still in the process of hearing back, but we're awaiting a result. We're hoping, wishful thinking, that they will review our case again with the rest of the Ninth Circuit bench. But for right now, our efforts are really focused on this climate resolution and proposal that we're proposing to Congress. And so we've been putting a lot of our efforts on that, and plaintiffs have been doing a lot of calls and lobbying virtually with our lawmakers out in DC and in our local areas. And so that's kind of where the situation with the case is at right now. It's a little bit of a focusing.
Your resolution would recognize children's rights with regard to climate, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's great.
This question is for Isaac. It's from Toby. It says, thank you for being here tonight. What keeps you going? How do you overcome anger and fear and keep hope alive enough to keep working for change?
Wow. So what keeps me going is my family. My family has been really supportive and basically been there since the literal beginning of my climate education, and has always helped me and encouraged me to search deeper and think of new and inventive ways that I can use my voice and what I have to offer for the climate movement. And so they're a really big inspiration of mine and will always and continue to be. But also hearing youth voices be more active. Like now, like especially, it's like every year, I swear, like since 2016 at least, that I'm seeing more and more youth exponentially get more active, be more aware, and not only just like social media active, but before pre-COVID, like out there in the streets marching, out there protesting with us, rallies, even creating their own marches by themselves, March for Our Lives, youth climate marches in Portland also. And so just seeing the increase of youth action, especially youth who can't vote on top of that, has really kept me going, because I've been doing this since I was in 6th grade, when literally my sister and I would go to climate events and we'd be the only kids most of the time. And so seeing from that to being the crowd being a complete mix of ages is really heartfelt, and I felt like I've done a little bit of something in that respect too. So that keeps me going.
Lee, writing this book, you must have had a chance to have your own observations of the youth voice in climate activism. What kinds of things did you learn from Isaac and other people on this case?
Well, two things. I mean, I think Isaac just expressed one of them really well, which is just the optimism of youth. And I know that, you know, Shiteska had expressed this to me as well, that just like they can't afford to be dire. And often when you have this conversation with adults, it's very doom and gloom. You know, it's a dark conversation. It's like, oh, climate change. For people who get it, they feel very stuck. And it's often, you know, a darker conversation. I don't find it that way with young people at all, which is really interesting. Just the optimism, the ideas. I remember Isaac's co-plaintiff Nathan saying to me one day, "You know what? When my parents were my age, there was no internet. Think of how much the world changed between then and now. I'm basically half as old as they are. So by the time I'm that age, think of how much farther we can get. Like, I just refuse to believe that there isn't technology here that gets us all the way out of this." So like those kinds of ideas come from younger people, and I think they're great, and it's a joy to hear them. I mean, the other thing that was perspective for me, it was very sobering, was really how high the stakes are for young people. I don't think I totally grasped that. You know, in the past, covering environmental issues, I didn't cover climate change tons. I don't think we understood in a general way, many of us and even scientists, like how quickly climate breakdown was really coming. That's relatively new information, but I also didn't understand as a kind of Gen X adult that we weren't going to solve this problem by making decisions at the cash register. And that's kind of how it was sold to me in my generation. If you just buy the right stuff, it'll all sort of go away. Like, it was a consumer movement. And so for me, I really had to shift to understanding how necessary systemic change was. And knowing that and seeing how little progress we've made in my generation toward that is really kind of horrible knowledge. And to hear it told by young people, um, it's pretty gut wrenching, because that feels to them so personal sometimes. And there's a lot of fear and real just heart sickness about some of the impacts. You know, Isaac's youngest co-plaintiff is facing his home going underwater, just like his sister is facing her birth community going underwater. I mean, these are really terrible thoughts. And to see them be so real for young people who understand the stakes and what we need to do, and how hard their feelings are toward adult lack of progress here, that was a lot to take in.
That relates to one of the other questions. It seems like in this current election cycle and political cycle, that the topic of climate change is really low on the list of narratives and stories being told. Why do you think that is this time around? It seemed like a bigger deal in 2016 as far as questions lobbed towards the candidates.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I do feel that way. I don't know that we've seen all the questions to the candidates, and I don't think that we saw necessarily the kind of pressure on candidates that we see on Biden from Sunrise and from the primary campaign. I mean, maybe I just wasn't watching as closely, but I do think it's there. I think that we're also living in these times where there is just a tremendous amount of other really important issues. 2016 was nicer days, right? We didn't have to talk about a pandemic, or well, we should have talked more about racial inequality, and talked some, but probably not enough. This is right in our face, you know, right along with climate change. So it's a lot. And maybe climate change doesn't get the airtime because it's a little more distant. It probably shouldn't be, but I think people still view it that way. I don't know. What do you think, Isaac?
No, yeah, I was gonna piggyback off what you said. I think we can all agree that Tuesday was a literal shit show. The debate was so terrible, and the candidates weren't able to even talk about anything for, we all know the obvious reason. I don't need to address the elephant in the room. And so I think that I don't necessarily really agree with the fact that climate change isn't a pressing topic. It was a question that was asked of the moderator, and it really just wasn't answered by the two candidates. But it's definitely an issue that a lot of viewers are paying attention to and want to hear what they have to say about, but they didn't necessarily get around to it. And so it doesn't get as much steam. You know, people are still focusing and will focus on what the highlight of the debate was, or the gut-wrenching comments that each candidate has to say. So they didn't really necessarily say anything about the climate crisis or acknowledge anything like that. But I think it's definitely something that is at least on Biden-Harris's radar. And they will probably try to tackle that and highlight that.
You know, this kind of goes back to our media conversation too a little bit, because, you know, talking to people about this book and press interviews the last week or so has been really interesting, because I get a lot of like, well, has there been a development in the case? We should talk about it when there's a development. It's like, no, we should talk about it because the development is that 3 million acres of forest burns in the West this year. Like, that's a significant development, you know, but there's still, I think, also in the media world, a need for what's happening right now to always, you know, lead. I think that the American press really needs to break out of some of these habits before we end up on the wrong side of history on this one, but that might be affecting the way the election discussion is happening too.
Okay, there's a question from Catherine for Isaac. This summer, we have seen the Sierra Club address systemic racism in the environmental movement, and Ruth Tyson's open letter to the Union of Concerned Scientists. What does Isaac think needs to happen in the US environmental movement to effectively address environmental racism?
So that's a really big question that I don't necessarily have like a concrete answer to, because of just the African-American experience in the United States from the get-go was not one that was very much welcoming. And so trying to figure out how, trying to figure out how the environmental movement has space in the BLM movement, and also intersectioning those two ideals into one is something that I am continuing to like look into and try to come up with an idea on. But environmental racism is a very, very much real thing, and doesn't necessarily get a lot of power behind it in the BLM movement. I feel like Sierra Club and the Center Riders movement and youth-led organizations have been trying to bring that to the forefront and bring that to the attention. But I haven't necessarily seen BLM say much about that at all, because it's really kind of focused on police brutality. But trying to draw the comparisons of environmental disadvantages due to redlining and red zoning of communities in like Portland, and especially in the South, Oklahoma and Texas, where a lot of oil refineries are, how they like to round up minority communities, predominantly African-American and Black, into areas that have a high concentration of toxins and pollutants that they use for fracking in the air, and drilling, and how kids are developing, and infants are developing asthma at much higher rates, and having hospitalizations at much higher rates due to that, due to those policies that were set in stone during the 60s, 50s, 40s, when segregation was very much the status quo. And so I guess that's something that I've been trying to inform a lot of my friends on, and trying to research into more myself. And that's just one example. There's plenty of other examples that can be addressed, but that's kind of been the main focus I've been on for a little while now.
Do either of you have any recommendations for authors or articles or places on the internet that you read regularly about environmental issues and climate change?
I don't necessarily have like a go-to site for climate information. I always have to keep up on what NASA is coming up with and what they're coming out with, and the United Nations environmental sector. They have both very reliable and complete articles and studies done on a variety of environmental issues. And so those are very much go-tos. And then I'm kind of on social media a lot. So Sierra Club, Sunrise Movement, 350.org are also kind of go-tos.
I subscribe to a lot of media. I think if you're looking for one-stop shopping that is like, you know, mainstream media articles, I would recommend the Society of Environmental Journalists has a digest. It's a roundup of environmental stories, and I think it's every day or like every few days sometimes, and it's actually really good. All the important environmental reporting tends to land there. Big breaking news items like the kinds of studies that Isaac's citing, they tend to land there as well, like when they're released. I really like the New York Times climate section. I also really like the Guardian's coverage of climate change because they call it climate breakdown at this stage, and they're really good about addressing youth voices. I'm a little bit biased because I write for them in that sometimes, but that's why I write for them, because I think they do a great job. DSMOG, also a great place to go for climate related news. I hear good things about GRIST, but I am actually not a GRIST reader. Maybe I should be. I also think that The Intercept's done really important and interesting work around people's rights as they relate to fossil fuel energy companies in some of the areas that Isaac just talked about, like in the South. There's a really good series that they produced about people's rights in protest around pipelines that was really, really amazing, that I'd recommend.
Excellent. Somebody in the chat is also recommending Job One for Humanity as a good source too. Yeah. Okay. We're getting close to the end of our time for questions. There is one thing that we do like to ask of all of our writers who come. Are you working on anything new, Lee? Any new stories or books on the horizon?
I just had an article release yesterday in ProPublica, and it was about a climate-related story. It's about Jordan Cove. A lot of people will understand, being from Oregon, what that is. I worked on that throughout the summer, just kind of looking at what are the forces driving this energy export facility that, like, broadly a lot of people agree there's no market for. And so some pretty interesting results. You can find that on ProPublica. All my social channels will have links. Looking ahead, I'm doing some work on fire for The Guardian, and that's kind of my short-term outlook. No new books planned right now. Of course, I really want to cover the Juliana case and whatever happens next.
We do have a question here that says, I'm a college freshman too, and I just met with the Sunrise Movement at my school for the first time just this week. I was wondering what you guys think of the climate disaster clock in Manhattan.
I defer to Isaac.
First off, really cool that you're joining the Sunrise Movement. Highly recommend that to any college freshman and just any college student in general, grad or undergrad. But the climate disaster clock in Manhattan, I think it was a very good refocus on the climate catastrophe that we're in the middle of right now. There's a lot of hot button issues that are going on right now, and I felt like the climate crisis definitely needed one of those reawakening type situations. And so that definitely was a very good tactic. But I also feel like the clock itself is very disheartening to a lot of people and can bring up a lot of climate anxiety or anxiety related to climate. And I haven't really tried to pay much attention to it because I'm just trying to keep my head down and grind and do what I can and do the most that I can to revert the situation that we're in right now. But then again, it is also a very good wake-up call for a lot of people who can handle it, because it is a very pressing issue and it's very, very relevant and very, very important that we do something about it like right now. And that's a very good alarm clock. It's its purpose.
You have anything to add, Lee?
No, I don't. I agree with what Isaac said, and I think he has more thoughts on it than I do.
This has been a really fascinating and informative conversation. I'm so appreciative that I was able to join you both tonight on behalf of Powell's Books for this event. The new book is called As the World Burns, The New Generation of Activists and the Landmark Legal Fight for Climate Change. I've shared some links to it in our chat tonight, so you can click on that and head to powells.com to get your copy. I believe, Lee, that they sent over some signed book plates, so if you do order a copy of the book, we'll also include one of the signed book plates. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Isaac, so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. It's been great. And thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Have a good night.